I think Rothko can speak to East, to Europe, to religious, to non-religious. He can speak to everybody. So what I wish for the centre is that it realises Rothko's dream, as it were, to belong to a place, but also to belong to the world. I first came here when the Mark Rothko Art Centre opened. I remember the journey from Riga. I remember it was cold and the river was swollen with ice and the stalks on the tops of the trees. And then I arrived here in Daugavpils, where I'd never been before. I'd been to Riga, and I came to write an article for the Financial Times on the Mark Rothko Art Centre when it opened. And I persuaded the BBC to allow me to do a programme devoted to it. So that's how I began. And for reasons we never know, I fell in love with the centre. And since then I've brought, I think, 3 British artists and 2 Chinese artists. So I'm always in love with the new project. So what interests me now is John HOYLAND, seeing him next to Rothko, because people have called John HOYLAND Europe's answer to Mark Rothko. But I remember the last exhibition we did of Kang Haitao, a Chinese artist. But I remember listening to somebody a local person looking at Kang Haitao's paintings of an old school and saying, this looks just like Latvia. And I was very moved that somebody recognised in a Chinese artist something that felt like it was at home. And of course, close to here is a Buddhist centre. And the whole issue of Buddhism and Mark Rothko, somebody rather glibly once said of Rothko's paintings that they were like Zen television. And this may be rather to underestimate the greatness of Rothko's paintings, but the sense of meditation that I think is there when you look at a Rothko painting, I think is important for all the artists I've brought, whether Kang Haitao or Hsiao, a very famous Italian Chinese artist who lived in Italy for 40 years, but he's hardly known because he lives between places. He's not Italian enough for the Italians and not Chinese enough. And we brought him here during COVID. So I never came. I only saw him remotely. So for me, this has been a very important place. I think I've done 6 exhibitions here, 5 that I've come to do. And as I increasingly feel that what used to be called Eastern Europe is more and more important, I think places like Daugavpils, a place that's on the way to lots of other places, will become more and more central to Europe. I knew it was the 10th anniversary of the Rothko Centre, and it struck me as important to bring an artist who knew Rothko, who admired his works, but also who was bigger than Europe and America. I'm one of these people who think the world is moving east, whether the centre of Europe will become Berlin and Warsaw rather than Paris and Berlin. But also it's moving east in more complicated ways. It's moving towards Asia. And one of the things I discovered with John HOYLAND is if you looked at his library, which is still there, his library isn't only full of books on Rothko and Matisse and Mijo, the great Spanish painter, but also on Japanese and Chinese art, on Zen, Japanese poetry, Chinese ink painting. And as I looked at HOYLAND's paintings, I began to feel they were much more global than we'd ever thought. Everybody had said HOYLAND belongs to America and to Britain, but actually I think he's a much more interesting painter than that, who draws on all these different traditions, Asian, European, as well as America, to make art. And this is a very difficult moment in the world, where everybody is moving back international beliefs. And there is an exhibition in Riga at the moment called Dismantling the Wall, about Latvian art from the 80s. And I think we culturally need to keep dismantling walls. And I think HOYLAND was a dismantler of walls. He connected with all kinds of global artists and art traditions, and that makes him, to me, increasingly important in a world that's trying to build more and more walls. The Rothko Centre is getting more and more important, but it's not, it needs to shout more. I don't think Latvia is very good at shouting. America is the world's kind of champion about shouting. And I think the noise from Latvia more generally, but particularly from this place. I still speak to many people who say, there's a Mark Rothko Art Centre in Daugavpils. So for me, the exhibitions, I hope, have helped to connect China and Britain with Daugavpils. But I think where it is, what it is, that, you know, it has a guy who was born here and who ended up in America and now has become one of the world's greatest artists. It's a metaphor for what Latvia needs to do. It needs to connect itself with the world. And I think the Mark Rothko Art Centre is helping to do that. But it needs a much bigger drum and a much louder voice in order to make itself heard in the world.